Introduction. Annie Chapman, born Eliza Ann Smith, was one of the unfortunate victims of Jack the Ripper, whose series of brutal murders in 1888 shocked and terrified London. This essay traces the life of Annie Chapman, from her early days in Paddington to the tragic circumstances that led her to the dangerous streets of Whitechapel, where she would meet a horrifying end. Eliza Ann Smith, known as Annie, was born in September 1841 in a small terrace house in Paddington, West London. Her father, George Smith, and her mother, Ruth Chapman, got married when Annie was about 6 months old, on the 22nd of February, 1842, at St. James Church, Westbourne Terrace. Annie had 4 siblings, 3 sisters and 1 brother. Unfortunately, her household cavalry with his job meant the family had to move house quite frequently. While living in Windsor, Annie met a relative of her mother, a young man named John Chapman, who was 3 years younger than Annie, but they got along very well. They started to visit each other quite frequently. The family had to return to London and then back to Windsor. However, Annie decided to stay in London, and she got a job as a domestic servant. She lodged with another servant at 2 Duke Street, London. After a while of Annie living there, her father retired from the cavalry and became a nobleman's manservant. Unfortunately, being retired and not in the cavalry caused him to be very depressed, and he couldn't cope with the depression. He committed suicide in 1864, which devastated Annie. Although Annie lived in London, John would visit her, and on one occasion, he proposed to her, and of course, she said yes. So, on the 1st of May, 1869, they got married at All Saints Church, Ennismore Gardens, Kensington. At first, John had a good job, so they rented a nice place, and Annie gave birth to a daughter. They found it financially hard, so they moved in with Annie's mother. While living there, they had another daughter. They decided to find another place to live, and things seemed to look up for them until Annie stole from John's boss to buy rum. She could not go a day without it. Of course, John was sacked. John did not know what to do about Annie's drinking, so he decided to ask her to go into a home for a while. He said he would pay for her treatment. Annie agreed with him and went into the home. Meanwhile, John was asked if he wanted a very prestigious job as a chauffeur for a very powerful man named Josiah Weeks. The job came with a nice house over the top of the stables at St. Leonard's Hill Mansion. John took the job, and to his surprise, there was also a nanny, Caroline Aylesbury, to look after the girls. One of them had epilepsy, which kept Caroline busy. Annie was doing well, so the home said she was okay to return home. Annie returned home to John and the girls, but most of the people in John's circle were not too happy with her return. However, it was not long before Annie was drinking rum again. John was not too happy with her, and in fear of losing his job again, he told her she had to go, even though she was pregnant with his child. At first, she refused but then decided it was no use arguing, and she left and went to stay with a friend just outside Windsor. On the 21st of November, Annie gave birth to a baby boy. Unfortunately, the little boy was paralyzed down one side. Annie was devastated, so she did what she could and took the baby to a special hospital that could treat his condition. In November 1882, Annie's daughter died. It destroyed Annie, and her drinking became worse. She would be seen wandering around in scruffy clothes and muddy boots. On several occasions, she would be arrested and held in the cells overnight to sober up and be let out in the morning. In 1884, Annie decided to go back to London. John had made it quite clear he would never take her back, so she had nothing to stay for. So, she made her way back to London, but it wouldn't be the London she was used to. She had no belongings and no money, so the only place she could go would be Whitechapel, East London, with its narrow, dark streets, filth, rats around every corner, and a stench in the air like she had never smelled before. She had walked into a dark life of overpopulation, prostitutes, and crime. Oh well, she thought, best make the most of it. This is home now. Annie would make money by crocheting and making paper flowers. John would give her 10 shillings now and again, but it didn't last long. If Annie couldn't sell what she made, she would sell herself to get money for a bed at night and a bottle of rum. Unfortunately, John gave up his job due to illness in the summer of 1886, which meant she wouldn't be receiving any more money from him. On the 25th of December, Annie was told that John had died of sclerosis. Annie was devastated. It said she was never the same after his death. Annie was now 45 years old, and she found it hard competing with all the young girls on the streets. When Annie finished work, she would go back to Crossingham's at 35, Dorset Street, a well-known lodging house. It was managed by a man named Timothy Donovan, who was not a nice man at all. Annie met a man named Ted Stanley. He would come through Whitechapel sometimes, and he would stay with Annie for a couple of days. He would also pay for her rent as long as she took no other man back to the lodge with her. On the 1st of September, her friend Amelia Palmer saw Annie standing by Christchurch, Spitalfields. Annie told her she was not feeling well and was going to spend a couple of days at the Spike, a nickname for a workhouse. She told Amelia that she hadn't had anything to eat or even a cup of tea. Amelia gave her tuppence and asked her not to spend it on rum. Annie was admitted to the Whitechapel workhouse. She had a cold bath and was given a bowl of skilly, which is watered-down porridge. At 5 p.m. on the 2nd of September, Amelia saw Annie again just outside 35, Dorset Street. At 11:30 p.m., Annie went back to the lodging house at Crossingham's. She hadn't been there for about 3 days. She went to the kitchen and sat by the fire. At 12:10, one of her friends from the lodge came in and shared a pint of beer with her. Annie disappeared from the kitchen. At 1:35 a.m., Annie was back at the lodging house, and she was drunk. She went upstairs to see the manager, Timothy Donovan. He shouted at her, "You've got money for drink but not for your bed. No money, no bed now, get out." With that, he had her escorted out. She walked off down Paternoster Row, going towards the market. "I'll be back," she shouted. At 5:30 a.m., Annie was seen by a few people who lived in Hanbury Street. She was seen by a woman talking to a man outside 29, Hanbury Street. "Hello, sir," Annie said to the gentleman. "Can I do something for you?" she said, holding out her hand to him, staggering towards him. As he took her hand, she guided him along a short hallway at the side of a house leading to a backyard. She would be okay tonight, she thought. As they entered the backyard, the Ripper flew towards her, holding her close. He tried to put his hand across Annie's mouth. She gave out a slight scream. The Ripper put his hands around her neck and rammed her into the fence. As Annie started to pass out, he got the knife and pushed it into Annie's throat as far as it would go. Blood squirted up the fence. He sliced her throat from ear to ear. As she fell, he laid her on her back. He leaned down and pulled up her garments. He pushed the knife into the lower part of her abdomen and sliced her open up to her chest. He pulled her apart and put his hands inside, pulling her intestines out and throwing them over her shoulder with pieces of skin attached. He was covered in blood, but he carried on, slicing out her uterus, half of her bladder, and the top part of a blood-drenched vagina. He put the parts, dripping with blood and skin, in his pocket and disappeared back into the shadows of the night. John Davis, who lodged at 29, Hanbury Street, got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, had a cup of tea, and went down to the backyard. As he looked out the back door, he noticed a woman lying near the bottom outside steps. The police were alerted, and a surgeon named George Bagster was called. The body was taken to Whitechapel Infirmary Mortuary in Old Montague Street. Annie's brother and her friend Amelia went and identified the body. Annie Chapman's funeral was held in secret on Friday, the 14th of September, 1888. Only Annie's family, the police, and the undertaker knew when it was held. Annie Chapman died on the 8th of September, 1888. She was 48 years old when she was killed. Annie was laid to rest at Manor Park Cemetery in Forest Gate, grave number 78. Her family was not allowed to place a headstone on the grave because it was a public area, and in the future, someone would be buried on top of her. But at present, Annie has her own headstone. Conclusion: Annie Chapman's life, marked by hardship, addiction, and loss, is a poignant example of the struggles faced by many women in Victorian London. Her death, like those of the other Ripper victims, not only highlights the vulnerabilities of those living on the margins of society but also serves as a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of one of history's most infamous eras. Though Annie was laid to rest without a headstone, her story endures as part of the tragic legacy of Jack the Ripper.